English translation 692nd Contact Sunday, the 29th of October 2017, 11:12 hours.
Greetings, Eduard, dear friend.
Greetings also to you, Ptaah. I was not expecting you today, though, but do be welcome, dear friend.
It is also extraordinary because I am in the station.
I see, but it is good that you are coming here because I have a few things I would like to discuss with you, if that is possible.
Of course.
First of all, I have a question. There was news on television that the U.S. is going to take some people to court in America regarding alleged election interference by Russia. But you said the other day that you could not find any such interference, even though you were monitoring things. So I do not understand why charges should be brought now.
For our part, as I have already explained to you in previous conversations, we have only monitored direct influences on electoral interference that were traced back to Putin and those parts of the Russian government that were in his direct sphere. In total, there were only 3 persons, together with Putin, from whom we could not detect any direct or personal election interference in relation to the U.S. presidential election.
On the 29th of October 2017, when Billy called up the 692nd contact report in the evening, the above text suddenly appeared on his screen while he was writing down the report. Billy, who had been aware of such insertions since the 5th of November 2015, when he was writing a new proposal for the preamble to the Swiss Constitution, immediately called various core group members present to his office to show them the text that had appeared, of which one of the core group members in question then also immediately took a screenshot. It is also worth noting that Billy's computer does not have an Arabic font that he could have used to write the lettering. He also no longer speaks Arabic, so he had to have the content of the lettering translated first, although this was already done in 2015.
Further clarifications were not relevant for us. Consequently, we also did not make any effort to carry out other and extended monitoring, which is why we also do not know whether there was election interference from outside Russian government circles or from private persons, parties and organizations, etc., and indeed also from the USA and other states.
So now it is really clear what you were monitoring and what you were not. That still needed to be clearly stated so that there is no misunderstanding.
Speaking of misunderstandings, I wanted to point out to you a long time ago, but which I have forgotten in the course of the last few years, that something should be corrected in Contact Report Volume Number 12 on page 197, Ptaah. Sentence 7 by a separate statement and, moreover, in the corresponding discussion report. The sentence listed as number 7 is incorrect with regard to the naming of my great-great-grandfather, Hylock.
Further, I can only explain that Charlemagne was recorded in our annals in long explanations by my great-great-grandfather, Hylock, which also includes extensive documentation of the approximately 300 years that are supposed to have been invented, as the earthly would-be medieval historians fantasize together.
Correctly, this naming and spelling error needs to be corrected, because in connection with Charlemagne, it was not my great-great-grandfather Hylock, but my grandfather Ezekiel who needs to be named.
This is unfortunate and has not occurred to any of us before. We have spoken before in relation to the public service practiced in Switzerland, but nothing of this was recorded in our conversation reports. Consequently, I want to talk to you about it today. In order to clearly explain what it is all about, I have copied the following from the internet.
Public Service Switzerland. Public Service. French, German, translated. Öffentlicher Dienst. Here rather, public services and public infrastructure is the term used in Switzerland to describe the totality of all services that the Confederation, the cantons and the municipalities have to provide to the general public. In other words, the services offered by the public authorities. The task of the public service is to ensure the basic provision of the population with standard infrastructure. German administrative law also uses the term Daseinsvorsorge for this. The Federal Council defines the term as follows. Public service comprises a politically defined basic supply of infrastructure goods and infrastructure services, which should be available to all sections of the population and regions of the country according to the same principles, in good quality and at reasonable prices. Federal Council. Report of the Federal Council, Basic Infrastructure Provision Public Service. Task Division. The public service is a typically Swiss division of tasks. At the federal level, it includes the General Federal Administration, postal services, telecommunications, electronic media, television and radio, public transport and, to some extent, road construction. The cantons and municipalities, on the other hand, are responsible, for example, for healthcare, education, waste disposal, in part road construction and other tasks defined as basic services, water, electricity, etc. Basic services and privatization, however, this does not mean that the entire politically defined basic supply of goods and services must be provided by state enterprises. Moreover, in the last 15 years, some of the former public enterprises have been partially or fully privatized. Typical examples are the former armament companies, now RUAG, the Swiss Federal Railways SBB, several hospitals, the health insurance company KK, Swisscom, formerly part of the state-owned PTT, and numerous transport companies e.g. the Lucerne Transport Company. Today, many public service tasks are put out to public and international tender. The previous operating company then competes against new providers. Typical examples are regional or local bus lines. Discussion about the public service is an ongoing controversial issue in Swiss politics. While many neoliberal-minded politicians want to leave as little as possible to the public sector and are of the opinion that private companies could also or better provide the services and demand more competition, the trade unions and the left-wing parties see it quite differently. At present, 2006, there is a debate about the complete privatization of Swisscom, in which the state holds a majority stake, and about the privatization of the Swiss Post, currently wholly owned by the Confederation. In 2008, broadband internet access was included in the Swiss Catalogue of Basic Services. The guaranteed basic service is now at least 2,000 kilobits per second kbit/s for downloading and 200 kbit/s for uploading. An increase to 3,000/300 is planned for 2018. Source: Wikipedia.
In my opinion, this public service does not bring any advantages to the population, but effectively only roaring disadvantages in many different ways, while all those who operate it receive horrendous financial profits on their accounts. And this is because all those who run this public service, be it the post office, the SBB, Swisscom, the hospitals and banks or other companies, are closing more and more of their branches, dismantling the railway stations and bus stops, limiting the transport options and thus depriving the citizens of the possibility to take care of their daily needs and necessities on short distances, be it at the post office, banks, shops, the SBB and other railway companies or other companies. The elderly, who have to get around with rollators or with walking sticks and other walking aids, are forced to travel further and further distances to get to the doctor, the grocery shop, or anywhere else. This is also true of hospitals, many of which have been closed in many places, so that sick patients can only go to hospitals far away, and even for visits to the sick, they can only be reached by traveling long distances. And this is happening everywhere, while more and more human beings are populating the world, over 100 million per year. And as a result, more and more branches of the post office. Banks, Swisscom, shops, and all kinds of companies, as well as more hospitals, are becoming necessary. But this does not concern the service public operators, because they're public service French. German translation, Öffentlicher Dienst, here rather to be called public services and public infrastructure, is described in Switzerland as the totality of all services which the Confederation, the cantons, and the municipalities have to provide to the general public, whereby, however, in my opinion, it must basically be said to have to provide, because the announced totality of all services is not provided in any way, but on the contrary, is increasingly restricted. Consequently, it is to be said that overall, effectively, no more services are being provided for the population, but rather more and more are being dismantled, and the people are being made more and more the serfs of those who should be providing the public service. In truth, it is the population itself that must provide the service. That is to say, the totality of all services and basic care, precisely the opposite of what is pompously promised by the state with the public service. And since this is the case, one can only speak of a public service. That is to say that the population itself must provide the entirety of all services and the basic provision of services, and this in an extremely difficult manner, because it is not possible to provide the entirety of all services and the basic provision of services. The letter was also sent in an extremely difficult way, because due to the complete dismantling of all necessary post offices, hospitals, shops, railway stations, railway and bus lines, bank branches, and the closure of companies and concerns, etc., there are no longer any possibilities of being able to do everything in a reasonable time and within a reasonable radius from the place of residence.
When writing further, the lettering already mentioned on page 194 appeared again, but with altered text.
This whole public service activity is therefore not effectively aimed at guaranteeing the totality of all services and the basic supply of the population, because the entire restriction and the ever more blatant dismantling of the necessary branches, etc., in every respect, which can no longer be used by the population for their needs and necessities, make their lives and their quality of life more difficult overall, etc. And the reason why this is being done in such a way is not to make things easier for the people and to ensure better basic services, but to enable them to be misappropriated on the one hand, and on the other hand to be financially exploited in an infamous way by the money-grubbing bigwigs and bosses who enrich themselves endlessly at the expense of the people. The whole thing is declared in a lying and fact-twisting manner with the term rationalization, which is explained in a literal paraphrase as making things more sensible, designing them expediently and streamlining them, whereby in the area of the economy and administration and in the area of the workforce, the work processes are to be made more economical and efficient, reorganized, restructured, simplified, and standardized in order to increase performance and reduce expenditure by means of mechanization, automation, and division of labor, etc. This is the only way to achieve this. Through rationalization, costs are reduced, of course, only for the firms and corporations and state enterprises, etc., that carry out the rationalization, which of course increases and boosts their profits and makes immense gains, while the wire pullers in the upper echelons pull their strings and then pocket undeserved rewards themselves, while the workers are fobbed off with low wages. In the case of the public service, this means that the population must effectively provide the totality of all services and their basic provision in the form of a public service itself, while the bigwigs, bosses in the state administration, etc., etc., who are located at the top, collect and accumulate the big dough, while the population must do everything itself with regard to the totality of all services and their basic provision with effort and difficulty. This is just like the serfs of all those who thought up the allegedly relieving and beneficial public service, which in reality is a public service, through which the population is forced to walk very long distances as a result of the dismantling of all the necessary post offices, bus lines, bus stations, railway stations, shops and hospitals, etc. is forced to walk very long distances to be able to take care of their needs, because they are forced to do so by the public service, and have to handle do and take care of everything very laboriously themselves, whereby the companies and corporations, the state and the upper elite profit horrendously. And this, while the prices in the entire food and other vital goods and commodities, trade, etc. for everything are outrageously and massively increased, while wages and pensions remain unchanged low or are set even lower, whereby especially financially underprivileged persons, especially old people without their own savings or with a mite already spent, can hardly afford the necessities of life any more, and are gnawing at the hunger cloth.
As you describe everything, the whole thing effectively has nothing to do with making life easier for the population, but on the contrary, it only benefits those who, as I want to say, pull the strings in the upper echelons and carry out the rationalization that benefits them while the population is harmed in many ways.
That is exactly what I mean. But look here, this was maneuvered back into my computer a few days ago, and in fact on the 26th of October 2017, 019 HRS, when I was writing my new book, Self-Determination. The consequence of this insertion into my text, there were 6 pages that I had worked out as a sequel, was that all the writing disappeared from my computer without a trace. Consequently, I have to write and code the whole thing again. This happened for the first time, after all, on the 5th of November 2015, at 2344 HRS, when I wrote a preamble and the religiously nonsensical was simply inserted into my text somehow. The hammer here is that the whole thing was in Arabic. But my computer does not have Arabic letters, so I cannot print the whole thing out either, which is why I have to create a photo that I can then print out. Somehow someone is trying to disrupt my work and drive me crazy. Maybe to declare me crazy in the outside world or something. What do you think?
This is the text that appeared in Billy's latest book when 6 pages of his written text disappeared without a trace and irretrievably from his computer. Billy then had to painstakingly rewrite the disappeared 6 pages. Not forgetting that 1 hour of coding work is equivalent to 28 hours of normally concentrative writing, which is an enormous amount of work.
Maybe Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach and their helpers can do something about it, because if they keep harassing me in this way, my work suffers. And besides, I get annoyed when I have to do the same work 2 or 3 times, because everything is extremely time-consuming and I get behind schedule with all that I have to do, also even for you.
I can understand that. But Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach and their working group have not yet made any progress in combating these malicious machinations, which I believe are due to the energetic effects known to you and which seem to be influencing believers who can penetrate your computer in a way that is inexplicable to me and cause you immense damage. But to want to discuss this would be nonsensical, which is why I now want to tell you, as I promised some time ago, the predictions of my great-great-grandfather Hylock for Earth humans and the Earth world, which he wrote down in 1446 BC, and which I have translated into German for you.
Of course, you always have to translate everything, also that of your father Schwath.
Of course, because all the records of my father and grandfathers were written down in our Pleiaren language. But here now.
Prediction of great-great-grandfather Hylac from 1446b. Emmanuel, CHR.
The life of the human beings in the world will degenerate over thousands of years into the distant future of modern times and for a very long time thereafter. Through delusion in deities and the like, into a wretched, unpleasant and degenerate life in false slavery to faith, corrupted by faith. A serious imprisonment in a delusion arises, which for thousands of years leads to strife and terrible wars and again to new perditions. Faith-based deceptions of the senses, dazzling works, conceits, misleadings, lies and deceit, mystifications, illusions and pretenses of phantasmagoria will be part of the order of all times to come and will claim many thousands of human lives and again destroy large parts of the world and its nature by wars, etc. Many thousands of lives. And the origin of this disaster will begin in about 200 years with the coming of the YSRJR Covenant Ptaah, monotheistic delusional tribe in Canaan, later Syria. Actual origin of Judaism, of the first world-encompassing delusion, which will be carried far into the distant future by wars, hatred, envy, retaliation, and lies and deceit for thousands of years. This first delusion, which will be called Creed Ptaah, religion, in the distant future, will then bring much misery, envy, distress, suffering, delusion, hatred, and destruction between all the peoples of the world for millennia. From the delusionary alliance Ptaah, community of faith, association of faith, unification of faith, that will be set in motion by the first one, the actual origin of the greatest illusionary evils of the world will emerge. From this origin, in another 700 years or so, another delusion will arise in the east of the world, through which bloodshed and hatred will also be spread over the world in the course of time. Another 500 years or so later, a herald Emmanuel, of the old teaching of the prophets will appear, whose teaching, however, will be falsified, misused, and from it a new delusion will be derived that is extremely slanderous, corrupting, spreading hatred, dangerous, death poisoning, and destructive worldwide. This will lead for more than 2 millennia to worldwide wars, war crimes, murders, hatred, persecutions, and immense destruction of countless human works, nature and its creatures. This will also involve an immense number of human beings who will multiply like locusts and devise and carry out machinations whose malignant effectiveness will destroy large parts of the planet and nature, causing much of nature's life to become extinct for all time. But some 500 years after the appearance of the messenger of the teaching of the prophets, a new messenger Ptaah, Muhammad, will come into existence in the revival of the same teaching to eradicate all that is false and reprehensible, but which malicious and delusional believers and those who misunderstand the teaching will have slanderously made of the teaching of the prophet of the previous messenger. But also the teachings of this new messenger will be extremely maliciously falsified and will cause wars, hatred, slander, and innumerable deaths throughout the next millennia, as well as fear, horror, and comprehensively deadly acts of violence. Ptaah, tyranny. Ptaah, tyranny. Despotism, dictatorship, reign of terror, totalitarian systems, absolutist rule, and terrorism, which will bring riots, unrest, violence, riots, street fights, tumults, insurrections, and assaults. Therefore, through clarity and reason, the human beings of modern times must learn to understand their situation leading into the abyss and free themselves from their false beliefs. Find the way to themselves, become themselves, and consciously learn to bear their own responsibility. Let it therefore be said to all mankind that they must leave their prison of faith and their delusion of faith, for otherwise great masses will be led astray by their faith in God, and a multitude in millions will be tortured and murdered by degenerating persecutions of faith, when the sun cross Ptaah, sun wheel. Swastika, as an evil sign announces the approaching time of terror, and the energy of the tiniest nuclear fission is released, misused, and becomes a destructive messenger of death. And if it happens, then it is also announced with it that all horrors will be more and more frequent in succession, whereby many sufferings will arise and only a small part will be capable of non-belief reason, to whom alone the truth will be recognizable and comprehensible, whereby also only a few will be wise enough to be able to find their actual happiness with knowledge. Everything around the human being will collapse and disappear, and nothing of the achievements of civilization will retain its existence. For the perversity of human beings will destroy everything, for it will shake the whole earth, and in the end no traces of the erroneous cults will survive. The great mass of many billions of human beings will degenerate under the yoke of ignorance and God-belief and will become alien to true life in a creative way and degenerate in every conceivable way. There will also be severe earthquakes as earth-mechanical natural phenomena, tremendous violent storms and unimagined conflagrations that will change the face of the earthly world. But the warnings will not be heeded, just as the old teaching of the prophets will not be heeded, which the new herald of modern times will bring and which will have the aim of awakening and sensitizing the intellect and reason of human beings, in order to enable them to free themselves from their errors and the delusion of their religious faith and from its follies, as well as from all their evil actions, deeds and crimes of all kinds. But nevertheless they shall be taught by the new herald and learn to understand that they alone are responsible for all their actions, deeds and conduct, as are also other intelligent life forms in the universe. The human beings should and must strive to be in harmony with the currents of nature and the universe, and thus with creation and all its continuance, and not refuse to go with the creative flow, lest they miss the benefits of the good conditions offered to them by the precepts of creation, which can be developed higher and higher by the intelligence and power of human beings themselves. But they must develop the evolution of their consciousness in order not to be left behind in their intellect and reason, in order not to have to wait millions of years for a foreign might to help them to an ascending wave of intellect and reason. The Earth and the whole solar system, as well as the universe as a whole, were not created by a cheap and inexistent deity, but as the only creation, by an immense outpouring of natural consequential creational natural impulses, and brought into an evolving direction. These creational natural impulses, which also work in human beings, are called love for the sake of understanding in a human sense, but are disregarded by countless human beings, regarded as sentimentality and, in spite of their great power, judged to be ridiculous. In fact, however, these impulses, which are called love, are the most magnificent of all the forces existing in human beings, beside which money and might are but trifling unvalues, and this also when human beings depend upon them decisively for the course and preservation of their lives. In the future, however, human beings must be particularly flooded with love and serve it, for otherwise their lives and consciousness will be tortured and damaged by unimaginable sufferings, difficulties and inhuman deeds and horrors, as a result of which their mental order, thoughts, thinking and behavior will become evil, criminal, sacrilegious, reprehensible, primitive and cruel. So then the terrible forms of the prophecies of the ancient prophets will be fulfilled, relating to the coming epoch, which will soon begin and be fulfilled, but will continue in a vicious and terrifying manner from the sign of the Sun Cross onwards, and will move continuously into the future. The times of great floods will also come upon the world, and where the earth is, there will be water, and where there is water, there will be earth. Hurricanes, gigantic fires and earthquakes will rain and sweep away everything. As through horror, wars, murders, revolutions, tyranny, dictatorship, totalitarianism, tyranny, arbitrary rule, unlimited G-vault and crime, an incredible amount of human blood will flow. Terrible explosions will be heard in many places on Earth as a result of explosion attacks and terrorist attacks, causing fear, horror, dread and terror in many places and countries. And in many cases the false and insane faith in God will be to blame for this, and it will always be a delusion of human beings, but never an answer or a demand of a God invented by human beings. On the contrary, nature will demand retribution for the crimes committed and perpetrated against it and against the earth by mankind, which is overflowing in its multitude. Let human beings be advised to practice peace, to live in peace and to rule the world in peace before the time of suffering and terror comes, for it has been written since time immemorial that not a single hair of the righteous will be harmed. So may the righteous human beings not be discouraged, but simply follow the path of learning for the personal advancement of their consciousness. As the old true prophets taught and as the new herald will teach in the modern age, and his teaching will also be carried out into the space of the world. The human beings must study his teaching and learn how the universe and thus the creation works. For it is necessary for them to learn to understand the world and the creation as nature and universe very quickly, and in this way to merge with it in knowledge. The human beings are predestined to learn in order to live in a way that is in harmony with nature and creation, just as every individual is capable of striving for and living according to the laws of creation. But for this, each one must form himself like a new continent, and emerge like an island from the vast sea and spread out in his love and knowledge to the best of his own ability. In the new time, the new proclaimer will be the founder of a new civilization, Ptaah, grouping, association, which will also be called a community, and which will undeterredly take a stand for the good and the right and for the old teaching of the prophets, Ptaah. Teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, It will spread the old teaching of the prophets through a new form and represent it to the human beings throughout the world. Through this, in time, the humanity of Earth will form a great family which will eventually be like a great and extensive body. In the new civilization, Ptaah, grouping, community, association, love will manifest in a way that will be exemplified by the herald in a simple and unifying way. Unfortunately, however, the earth will remain a planet of struggle, toil, misery, and hardship, even though in modern times the teaching of the new messenger will gradually be spread throughout the earth by new modern ways and means. The forces of evil and darkness will probably feel oppressed and slowly withdraw, but the earth and its humanity will never be finally liberated from them. Many human beings following the teaching of the Annunciator will walk a new, better and clearer path. A path of new life, which will lead to the development of consciousness, to understanding and reason, to inner peace, to inner freedom and joy of life, and to true human beinghood. Others, however, the unrighteous and degenerate, in their senseless pride and unruliness, will continue to lead their lives in a nefarious manner, condemning all that is creative and lacking in understanding. In the end, however, they will have to come to understand that their old direction of life is completely wrong and no longer compatible with the new world which will be created by the new teaching and from which a new culture and civilization will awaken. It will then only be a matter of time when the light of truth, goodness, and justice will awaken and triumph. Religions will lose their power and truth will have to take its rightful place when the common basis of all God belief systems collapses. As a result, bad human beings will slowly give up the intensity of their evil beliefs and turn to the peacefulness of truth and to their fellow human beings. But many of them will also hate the new herald of the modern age, and they will viciously injure his honor with hostile insults and false accusations, words of lies and malicious slander invented in anger. And shame will be done to his reputation in sinister plots. Note Ptaah, injustices, assassinations, assaults, will be perpetrated against him. Also, through hateful followers of the faith, there will also be deliberate attempts to despicably and cunningly destroy his commitment and work with many new tools of modern times. Note Ptaah. Information possibilities, internet, media, radio, television. But all those who attack will harm themselves, for their lives will be joyless and they themselves will be hated by their fellow human beings. Because they will not accept the new life with regard to the old teachings of the prophets, consequently they will perish in their lives like rotten, harmful fruit. But it will also be on earth that certain continents will perish and others will emerge, because not only the human beings, but also the face of the world will change completely. And there will be many dangers in the future millennia of which mankind is not yet aware and which will bring them much suffering, hardship, misery, wars, damage and destruction. Also, many human beings will continue for a long time to pursue dishonorable, unworthy, impure, dangerous goals that will ultimately doom them to failure. And this will be so, while the others who respectfully learn and obey the teachings of the new announcer of the modern age will deal honorably with their lives and with all things. Thanks to the teaching of the prophets of old, the earth will one day become a blessed planet. But until then humanity will still be hit by a great deal of suffering, misery and hardship, and its consciousness will not yet be awakened. So it will still take centuries and millennia until everything is fulfilled in such a way that the teaching of the ancient prophets becomes the true teaching of the life for all mankind. So it must still prepare itself for great and severe trials and overcome them, for it cannot avoid them and must learn to master them, whether it likes it or not, otherwise it will perish one day.
Astonishing. And that was predicted about 3,500 years ago by your great-great-grandfather Helak. He saw very far into the future.
He looked at the future.
So not probability calculations, but looking at the future.
Correct.
Then that is also clear. But something else. For years we have been talking about future things in private, as I have also done recently in an open way with regard to my probability calculations. What we have discussed privately, however, we have deliberately kept it that way in order not to predict things that could arouse fear among the human beings of Earth. However, 9 days ago I made a number of statements with my probability calculations about what could happen in the future, as well as about bioweapons and biodiseases and artificially induced diseases and epidemics, which we have often discussed in private. We also talked about swine fever, Ebola, SARS, and pandemics. According to your explanations, these epidemics were not explicitly created consciously, as conspiracy theorists claim to the contrary, but they were transmitted to human beings in the form of viruses through the eating of meat from wild creatures and also through touching, excrement and injuries from and by wild creatures, and this happened through bats, etc., as is the case, for example, with the various types of swine fever and Ebola. In this way, many other diseases had also been transmitted from animals, insects, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and various other life forms to human beings, whereby bacteria and viruses mutated and adapted to cause disease in human beings. During a conversation you said, according to the 598th contact conversation from the 4th of October 2014, Pleiadian Pleiaren Contact Reports, Volume 14, page 10, the following.
To this I can explain the following. The Ebola virus was transmitted from animals to human beings, as was also the HI virus. In the case of HIV, the small green monkeys were the carriers of the virus, and in the case of the Ebola virus, the first sources of infection were bats, fruit bats, and monkeys. The Ebola virus gives rise to the so-called Ebola viral hemorrhagic fever, associated with internal and external bleeding. Ebola originated from the consumption of wild animal meat and contact with animals infected with the Ebola virus, which is also still the case. Human-to-human transmission is also possible. Although physical contact and direct contact with the blood or other bodily fluids of human beings who have contracted or died from Ebola is sufficient for infection. The disease can also be transmitted over short distances through the air and thus infect human beings. Just as sweat exhalation can also be sufficient for infection if a human being comes into contact with it. Certain biting insects can also transmit the Ebola virus under certain circumstances, as can various small and larger animal and vertebrate species, etc., if they are infected with the Ebola virus. In addition, the Ebola virus can be deposited on all kinds of objects, such as eating utensils, door traps, toilets, and other things, whereby the viruses can survive for up to 2 months and have an infecting effect.
On the other hand, as you also explained, epidemics, for example, SARS, were also caused by careless laboratory experiments, whereby bugs or viruses were released. And it is precisely with laboratory experiments, that I would like to come to the point that I have addressed in my probability calculations under point 1, among other things, as follows.
This future world powerful elite will know no mercy and will carry out an annihilation of mankind that could not be more terrible. And for this, various possibilities are likely to emerge, such as that various traditional deadly epidemics will be reworked and prepared with new deadly agents, but also artificially produced diseases will be used to decimate humanity. Likewise, the calculations also indicate that infectious toxic biological substances will be secretly used to decimate humanity, and that their deadly effects will be presented as new and incurable epidemics, whereby these toxins will then penetrate the entire organism via the respiratory tract and the mouth as well as via the skin and mucous membranes, whereby unstoppable mass deaths will inevitably occur. Purposefully induced famines and wars, poisoning of food and drinking water will also be part of the arsenal of decimating human beings to a still governable minimum, which will occur worldwide, so not only in individual murderous and dictatorially led states.
But now to what we had been talking about on and off for years and not openly discussing, since I have now openly mentioned that with my probability calculations, as it is reproduced in the excerpt, so the question, whether it can now be possible to say something about it, that it has been tinkered with for quite some time. What is hidden in this excerpt?
Your question is probably justified, which is why I guess that it is now also possible and allowed to speak openly about it and release the corresponding information. Consequently, I also want to take a stand on it right away. The fact is that for many decades now, a criminal and criminally inclined part, and also certain other asocial elements of Earth humans can no longer be kept under control, and can no longer be stopped by laws and punitive measures, just as they can no longer be governed. For some time now, the earthly population has been in such a desolate state with regard to its still effective governability that, generally, all efforts of those responsible in the governments and other higher elites, as well as the security forces, are failing more and more, which is why ways have been sought for a long time to be able to counteract the evil in the long term. As I explained to you back in 1996, a certain grouping of upper elites got together a long time ago and drew up a plan to solve the excessive overpopulation problem and made a decision which, in the long term, tends towards a drastic reduction of Earth humans. The secret plan in this regard, which was already conceived some 20 years ago, is based exactly on what you have calculated as a probability. Namely that biologically based epidemics and pandemics are to be created in the form of diseases and plagues, which have already been secretly worked on since the decision at that time. The decision is to collect the deoxyribonucleic acid of Earth humans on a nation-specific basis, illegally, of course, in order to biochemically alter the biomolecules and carriers of genetic information. That is to say, the genes of the various nations that occur in certain types of viruses in such a way that a fatal outcome is inevitable when the spread of diseases and epidemics takes place. However, the fact that all the necessary data is collected, clarified, researched, and prepared on a nation-specific basis is justified by the fact that, when the future time comes, for the reduction attack against the Earth's population, the action will take place according to the nation-specific overpopulation level. This means that then, depending on the excessive population level of a nation, various population reduction, measures and precautions will be taken to spare and preserve a certain number of the population. This population will then be under the strictest control of the upper elites and will only be allowed to produce offspring in a lawful and controlled manner, in order to avoid a new emergence and growth of a renewed overpopulation. In addition, violations of these legal orders will also be subject to legal regulations and extremely harsh punishments, which can also be directed against life and limb. And the decision on the above-mentioned data collection has been implemented in a secret manner for a long time, for about 2 decades now, whereby work has also been going on for some time to test, on a small scale, already created new and at first seemingly harmless and periodic forms of disease, in particular those which are periodic and spread epidemically, or which occur in temporal and local accumulations. The large-scale use of such lethal substances shall then one day gradually take place in such a way that everything shall appear epidemic-like and pandemic-like, like conventionally emerging diseases and epidemics. After that, very specific peoples are to be specifically infected on a large scale with certain biologically created new and deadly diseases and epidemics in order to literally wipe them out to a certain minimum. And that tests are already being carried out in this form is unfortunately a fact. Although these experiments are still in the very early stages, they will lead to effective results in the foreseeable future.
Hunt for Russian DNA, West forges novel bioweapon Sputnik, Tuesday, the 31st of October, 2017, 1753 Universal Time Coordinated.
Franz Klintsevich suspects that a new bioweapon tailored specifically for the Russians is being forged in the West. The Russian security politician thus commented on information according to which unknown persons are collecting biosamples from Russian tribal peoples. That biosamples are being collected across the country for an unclear purpose, President Vladimir Putin had said on Monday. It is no secret that each tribe reacts differently to a biological weapon, said Klintsevich, deputy head of the Security Committee of the Federation Council, Russia's upper house of parliament. That is why the biosamples would be taken in different geographical regions, he said. The West is very meticulous and wants to be sure if it comes to using bioweapons. While he could not claim that a biowar against Russia was immediately in the pipeline, Klintsevich said. But scenarios for an emergency are certainly already being played out. These activities, which have been going on for some time, have now taken on outrageous forms, the politician said. According to Klintsevich, the fact that President Putin addressed the issue personally is no coincidence. The relevant services in the West must know that we are aware of their interest. Military expert Igor Nikulin agreed that tissue samples could be used to create a new generation of biological weapons. According to the expert, viruses, for example, could be programmed to work only against a certain nationality. First attempts of this kind had already been made in the 1990s with the Human Genome Program, the expert told broadcaster RT. In the 0 years, under whatever noble pretext, but always in the interest of the US Department of Defense, various genealogical studies were carried out. That the Slavic group, and especially the Russians, are the focus of interest would speak for itself. Source: Jagnak Russische DNA, Western Schmiedet Neuartig Biowaff.
Yes, that corresponds to what we have already talked about several times and what you said the other day, that the probability calculation with regard to the actual coming and becoming of this reduction of humanity already amounts to a high percentage possibility. Precisely that in the future, everything will circumferentially turn out that way.
That is correct. The current probability calculation is about 51% that it will turn out that way.
Then that is also clear. Thanks for your explanation, and I think 51% probability is quite a lot. And if overpopulation continues to increase as rapidly as it has been for years, then everything can come to a head quite quickly and cause the calculations to come true. So if nothing is done to stop the mass increase of Earth humans and bring it under control, then for their future, precisely for our distant descendants, a great deal of disaster will loom in the sky of destiny, and the then small humanity will perhaps become serfs of the upper elites. And their ancestors will bear the blame for this, precisely today's humanity and its descendants, who continue to high-handedly breed the overpopulation, and do not care in any way about the future. And the bulk of the present and future population of the earth not only do not care for the weal and woe of their descendants, but also do not care for that of their descendants and again their descendants and all distant descendants.
What can really become possible if people continue to live in ignorance and unreason? And what you say in regard to present Earth humans not caring for the weal and woe of their descendants, and also not caring for their descendants, and in turn for their descendants, etc., that corresponds to an indisputable fact.
What evil, despotism, criminality, hatred, crime, murder and manslaughter, terror, tyranny and contempt for humanity, etc. result from this, already from children who are no longer educated, from youths and adults, is reported daily by news agencies all over the world, in addition to what one perceives, sees, and experiences oneself when walking through the villages and towns and over the streets. And the worst thing is that the majority of these children, young people and adults, still believe in religion and sex and are dependent on them and act in this delusion, precisely in accordance with the pathologically stupid religious sectarian heresies of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or as the saying goes, if you do not want to be my brother, I will bash your head in. Since time immemorial, it can be seen, experienced, and learned over and over again that, as a rule, the religious and sectarian believers are the most vicious, brutal, and worst earthlings when it comes to their own welfare, possessions, and right. If they feel they are in the right, then they quickly resort to all means to demand it, be it through foul-mouthed and swearing insults, abuse, material, reputational, or psychological damage, hatred, slander, stalking, legal proceedings, police reports, as well as physical or armed violence. And if wars are waged, then the deadly weapons are religiously and sectarianly blessed in the name of a bloodthirsty God, so that as many innocent human beings as possible can be killed and bestially slaughtered. This then fulfills what is preached to the confused believers in religion and sex, namely the reality that love of one's neighbor, love of humanity, peace, freedom, and humanity in the religious sectarian belief sense are only empty phrases, which are only used to pretend a false self-righteousness on the outside, but in one's own interior to be an effectively bestial devilish entity. And all this in the name of an allegedly loving but imaginary God, for whom the believers go through fire and resort to violence and weapons in order to harm their fellow human beings without hesitation and to inflict suffering and harm on them. This on the one hand, while on the other hand they also spread their malicious mischief through lies, insults, and slander, etc., for which they do not even feel guilty, but for which they do something, namely by contributing a mite with regard to money and goods collections for the needy and distressed, etc. And so they live under the delusion that they have done their duty with regard to their falsehoods, lies, violence, insults, and slander against their fellow human beings, and are consequently free of guilt. Thus they can possibly live their whole lives and be free and peaceful, according to their sense of faith. Of course, I must also be honest in this respect and say that in what I have said, I am effectively only talking about the majority of brain-addled delusions of faith in God, who immediately flip out, go berserk, resort to violence and weapons, and go crazy if they see any benefit for themselves in it and believe that they are therefore given the right to harass, harm, and take violent or even deadly action against any fellow human beings. I am only talking about this majority, but in no way about the minority of believers in religions and sects who take their faith in God extremely seriously, and who strive to lead their lives and existence righteously in accordance with all the good that their faith requires them to live, act and behave in, such as leading their lives in real love, neighborly love, compassion, honesty, peace, freedom, goodness, and dignity, etc. For these believers, I am talking about my own words. My words are not meant for these believing human beings and are therefore not addressed to them with evil ulterior motives. For if they cultivate their faith righteously in this aforementioned manner and lead their lives accordingly, and also express it in existence, then they have my full respect and appreciation in all seriousness.
I know that, but I do not think I need to comment on all you have stated.
Is not necessary, no. But tell me, with regard to the nonsensical religious sectarian insertions in my computer writing, Yanarara and Zafanat Paniach have made an effort, and have also said that they will continue to make an effort to find out, on the one hand, how the whole thing gets into my computer, and, on the other hand, where it comes from in the first place. But so far I have not heard anything from them that they have found anything.
Unfortunately, they have not so far. But they know by now that these religious and sectarian intrusions into your computer and the irrevocable destruction of your written work that goes with it are not done via the internet, because you only do your work locally and not via the server, as you explained. So Yanarara and Zafanat Paniak concentrated their investigation work on the electrical power supply network and checked it extremely thoroughly during several months. But they could not find anything concerning the disturbance influences you mentioned. On the other hand, other disturbances occur via this electrical power supply network, which can have an effect on certain computers in the center and in its wider vicinity, as a result of which malfunctions, etc., can occur. The origin from where and how these interference inputs into the electrical power supply network occur could not be determined so far. It is clear, however, that these disturbances are controlled by the electrical energy supply network, so that they are not based on any natural or inexplicable factors, but clearly on electrotechnical manipulations carried out by Earth humans. But as far as the break-ins into your computer and the irrevocable destruction of your writing are concerned, Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach are so far faced with an unsolved problem. This is because, on the one hand, they have not yet been able to gain any knowledge about where these religious sectarian meaninglessnesses and limitations of reason come from. On the other hand, with the electrical and electronic techniques that still exist on Earth, which are still in need of extreme development, it cannot be possible at all to use a form of wire-bound transmission of signals via a so-called carrier frequency technique in such a way that such controlled and targeted interference phenomena could be carried out. Also, the possibility of practicing such religious sectarian delusional absurdities into your writings of your computer by means of radio technology can be ruled out. Because in order to transmit radio signals into your computer in a controlled manner with the help of modulated electromagnetic waves, in order to destroy your writings in a targeted manner, all earthly radio technology systems are as yet absolutely incapable of this, according to our findings, and are still too much in need of development, Indeed, too primitive, I must say.
But would there perhaps be a possibility that secretly something like this might exist after all?
We are not aware of it, and if it were, the whole thing would have to have been developed and manufactured in the utmost secrecy in such a way that even we could not get to know about it.
I see, but perhaps it could be, especially when I consider that the entire public of the human beings of Earth are not informed of all the military, scientific and governmental state-of-the-art developments and inventions that are kept secret and under lock and key.
That possibility would exist, but we are really not aware of anything in that regard.
Even outside your directives that do not allow you to talk about certain things?
I would say to that I would not be allowed to say anything as a result of the directives.
Sure, it was just a question for clarification. And of course, you also cannot know everything, because that would be going too far.
As you say, that's how it is. But now I have to address some things that are not necessarily as an open conversation.
Then the following, which I also do not want to talk about openly.